tools are typically used, what can you do with them, how do you use them, and etc. And then we're going to work on actually doing stuff. So POSSE is not about giving you lots of presentations and stuff and etc. It's about doing stuff, because the earlier you get into that, the more you get out of it. That's why yesterday we had a tough day by going through all the technology we typically use. And what we've learned yesterday already was something that happens quite often in these situations, that people are quite astonished about what exists out there. You know, everybody's hunting for whatever tool and looking at the big companies of Microsoft and etc. to deliver some stuff, while completely ignoring that it already exists out there since 20, 30 years. Which is, you know, why open source is so completely different, because we have the tools and we don't have to care about them. It's fading, yeah, that happens every 10 minutes. It's a security concept called screensaver. I even put my picture on my computer so I know it's mine, just to make sure it will not happen again. So then here we're going to, so these are combined, so over lunch you can relax and find some information and prepare yourself for the second part. And then we're going through the most important part of a lot of open source projects, called man pages, documentations, how do they work, how are they updated, how are they managed, etc., etc. And then again, in closing, blogging and reflection, create a blog entry for today, and also discuss a little bit about what happened. Now, if we talk about FOSS projects, as I said yesterday, there are 100,000 plus projects out there. So rule number one is, don't reinvent the wheel. It's better to join an existing community as to try to create something new. Whatever you might think of that might be a cool open source project, for sure already exists. That's a fundamental rule. Now, how do you find this stuff? And how do you characterize it? And how do you find out if it's worth working on it? Now, we have, as you can see here, if you scroll down to this part, there is a community characterization worksheet that we've prepared. And I'm going to walk you through that. And then we could possibly even take an example and go through them. Create them yourself and work on them. So first of all, you know, there are lots of tools to find stuff, Olo, OpenHatch, the older stuff like FreshMeat, SourceForge, and etc., where all of these informations typically come together to find open source communities. Then we typically say select one active software project, which is already an important part. How do you find out if a project is really active and not dead? Of these 100,000 plus projects, a lot of them are effectively dead. A lot of them are abandoned, orphaned, the project manager doesn't care, the people are in heavy fights on mailing lists but are not productive, etc., etc., etc. So that's why we always say have an alternative handy, because, as I said, everything exists at least 2 or 3 times. And if your first choice turns out to be a wrong one because it's not really active or whatever, take the second one. Now, how do you dig deeper into that? As we've told you about the tools yesterday, it's very simple to use exactly these tools to find out how active a project is. So check the IRC logs if they're available. Whatever version control system they're using, if it's Git, CVS, SVN, whatever, see how active that is. Typically, all of these repositories and version control systems have a mailing list, a commit mailing list, where every change is recorded, so you can subscribe to the commit mailing list, go through the archives, and if you see that there is always a burst, and then 6 months nothing happens, you know something might be fishy on this project. Also interesting for me is to look how many people are actively working on committing. There are a lot of projects where only 1 or 2 guys or girls are really committing and the rest is doing nothing, just sitting there discussing and etc. That might not be your perfect active project, because typically if you have a very small group, it's very tough to get in there. Now, any communication channel you find in this community use, try to answer this set of questions, which is a flexible set. You know, this is not the definitive set, but it shows you a little bit about how we think. So, what's the software projects, its purpose and goals? So as an example, just for the fun of it, we'll take a project that I've been working on in the past. I'm not active in there now for a few years, but at that time it was, and still is, one of the biggest open source e-commerce solutions. It's called OS Commerce. I don't know if anyone has heard of it before. It's written in PHP. So if you want to look it up on your laptop, it's oscommerce.com. oscommerce.com, create solutions, and etc. So what's the software project? Deliver e-commerce solutions. What's its purpose? Make money for the owner and do it in the best possible way. And what are the goals? World domination, as always. That's what we typically are aiming for. A brief history of the project. This is typically one of the hardest parts to find out. Some projects have shiny pages with their complete history. Many of them don't. So finding out the history typically is then done by going through mailing list archives, see how long does it go back, what were the discussions being taken there, etc. Now, then look at the version control repository, etc., etc., etc. Try to find out who approves patches. Now, everybody says open source is about everyone can participate and we're all in for a shiny, better world. Typically, open source projects don't work like that. Open source projects are typically run in a sort of dictatorship model where there is a select group of people that really care about the project, that have the insight, a long history, and they are the people that have the commit access to the repository. So what does that mean? For the people who've never worked with version control systems, it's quite it has all the files that make up the project, all the source code files, and if you want to make a change in there, for example, there's a typo in whatever file, or you want to add a new function, you have to change something in that repository. Now, you program that locally, you prepare it, and then you give the diffs, so the differences between what is in the upstream repository and the changes you've made. That's what you send to the repository. If you are allowed to commit, it will then change the version of the files, and then everyone who downloads it gets a new version. This is called committing. And with this commit, typically you'll notice that not everyone is allowed to commit into the source tree, which is normal, because especially new people typically tend to break things, they don't know everything about how to do it, they do it wrong. So typically not everyone is allowed to commit to a repository. So you have to find out who is responsible for approving patches, who has commit access. Every version control system will tell you that. On the mailing list you will see it by simply looking at the commit messages. You will find out who is committing and who is allowed to commit. I'll just switch off the screensaver in a second. What is a good timer? How many people have commit access, which is also important. Who's involved in the history of the project? Did it fork at a time in the project? Were people not happy with how the original project leader was doing stuff? Who are the principal contributors? Have they changed over time? Which is a good health indicator. Because one of the things you want to make sure is that you're investing your time, your efforts, your resources in a project that has a long life. You don't want to invest in something that's already dying or already gone. Who are maintainers, who is on the front and back end, who manages the community, who answers questions on the mailing lists. All of that stuff is what you want to know about. Now, in OS Commerce, it's really quite simple. There is typically one guy who decides everything. That's Harald Ponce de Leon, and he's doing this since round about 2000. So it's a very old project. And I was in there from 2001 till round about 2004. Was a core developer, so I had full commit access. I could do everything, which was a good thing because it gave me a good job, because people were noticing what I'm doing here. And then this is the interesting part, and that's why I put it up as an example, OS Commerce. How is the project's participation trending and why? Many people have left OS Commerce. For a very simple reason. Harald is not the simplest person to deal with. He's a very egoistic guy, and he believes that he is the only one with wisdom on this planet, which makes it really tough to get new features in there, and it typically involves lots of beer drinking and convincing and etc. So these are the stuff. This is a simple way of finding out how good a project is. Let me show you a concrete example of this in action. It's another project that we've already discussed yesterday a little bit. It's called Statusnet. Statusnet is an open source version of Twitter, completely Twitter compatible API-wise, but it's federated and distributed, so not a central server. You can set up a Statusnet instance in your own organization, behind your firewall, in your intranet, so you have Twitter-like communication, completely open source. Now, there is a guy here called well, it's a girl actually, Shiny Brenda, and they have written a little tool that goes over the commit mailing list, and from the commit mailing list generates a movie that shows you how the project has evolved over time. So what you see in this movie is here, I will start the movie soon, here are files, and they typically are generated in a normal visualization with lines between them, showing directories and files and etc. And you have people, here even Prodomu, who is the CEO of Statusnet, the main programmer of it, and he's flying around editing the files, and you will see in the next few minutes, while I keep on talking, how the project has evolved over time. And this is a very good visualization of stuff. Let's see if I can get some more sound out of it.
Maybe turn the lights down.
Yep.
Keep in mind, everyone, that everything that is posted here, I posted as a link on IRC. So if you want to check it out, just go to IRC, click on the links.
So here you see how this project is evolving. Lots of files here. Here is Ivan flying around, patching files, putting laser beams on them. And now you see a lot of people are working here on these files. People are coming in. They disappear if they don't commit. So here is Charan. Now he's disappearing because he didn't commit for a long time. Ivan is still busy, busy, busy. And you see how over time this project evolves. Up here, hard to read, you can see the date. So we're now in February 2009. And this is simply made by going through the commit mailing list and visualizing the stuff. And you see here, the project is growing bigger. Lots of files are being created here. Then Ivan flies back here. Other people are flying around. What you see here is that this is a very healthy project. People are coming in. People are changing stuff. Some people do more. Some people are more active. Some people focus on stuff. People leave. People come in. But it works. And this is a brilliant visualization of how a good open source project should look like. Now there are different projects where you will effectively see only one guy or two guys doing all the work. So by using this tool by the way is called Gores. So you take this tool Gores, it's a shell script effectively, and you tell it where the archive is of the mailing list, and it will create this kind of movie. With lots of options nowadays, you can also do it three-dimensional if you want to. But I think this is specifically for students and etc. A very good visualization of what an open source project should look like. So, as you've seen, or as you are continuing to see, these people, few people are very active, doing a lot of stuff. Other people drop in, fall out, etc., etc. But the project keeps on evolving. Structure seems to be wise, so there's not many branches disappearing or new branches coming up. This is a tool I really use quite a lot to check the health and the state of an open source project, because it gives you better insight as your normal way of looking at mailing lists. Questions so far? I know it's good to look at it. It's really impressive. So we are now, where are we? In June 2009.
Are there lots of these videos on YouTube?
There should be lots of them, yeah. Now somebody tried to do this with the kernel mailing list. Yeah. The Linux kernel, as the most famous open source project nowadays, it's thousands of developers, committers, and people checking in and etc. So a visualization of the Linux kernel would really be chaotic. But this is a good size of a project to see how it evolves and how it moves along. So now we're almost done. Somebody's leaving there again. And now you see we have a group of 6 people, round about 6, 7 people. And as you can imagine, even after creating the project and getting his first few customers around this, decided to create a company to support all of this. And you can imagine which guys he hired. So see, now it's getting more attractive. A lot of people coming in, because now it starts working. That's where he added the Twitter compatibility layer. Yep.
No, it's just that it reminds me of the story of how before Mark Shuttleworth, we went went on one of those icebreaker holidays to Antarctica, the Russian icebreaker. In his laptop, he had the archives of the Debian project, and he went through it. Obviously, didn't have a tool like this.
Yeah.
He went through the logs of all the Debian IRC chat and everything to get an idea of who's who in Debian, and then he sort of headhunted them and started to Ubuntu and started Canonical.
Yeah.
So just think if he had a tool like this, he wouldn't have had to spend so much time doing it.
Yeah, so, again, it's about being lazy, as always. I found this tool, and I noticed it saves me a lot of time, because I also was going through mailing list archives, and you're never neutral in that. There's some people you like because, the language they write, or they're a little bit sarcastic, and etc., and you tend to prefer to read their messages, and you ignore the other messages. But this is an abstraction layer that gives you really a good insight into the current state of a project. So these kind of tools is what is really needed. So imagine, for example, in Red Hat, just to give you an example on how we select to include open source into our distribution. If we deliver Red Hat Enterprise Linux to our customers, we have to support it for 7 years and now going to 10 years. So if we have open source projects in there that will not survive for the next 3 or 4 years, we will have a giant problem. So we need to be sure that we find projects that have a long-term activity and will continue to exist. And that's why I say, don't reinvent the wheel. Trying to start a new community, a vibrant community, is really hardcore. Many people say, Mozilla, Firefox, wow, cool project, but we need this and that, and then let's fork it, because that's what you can do. Forking is the most expensive operation that exists in open source. Sometimes it's needed. So right now, as you've probably seen in the news, a few good friends of mine, and Red Hat, and Novell, and Google, and IBM, and etc., are forking OpenOffice, because we don't believe Oracle understands what open source really is about. And people, governments all across the planet are using OpenOffice and are basing their infrastructure on ODF. So they need to be assured that there is a non-corporate driven community behind this that handles it. So that's why we forked OpenOffice. We called it LibreOffice, and let's hope it is successful. There are a few rare examples of successful forks. There are not much of them. Many of them typically come from the point where a company is taking over an open source project and it becomes a corporate-driven community. So for example, the content management system, what was its name again before it was split? Not Samba, but it became Joomla after, was it Mambo? Yeah, Mambo. Yeah. So Mambo was a PHP open source content management system competing with Typo3, the big open source content management system. I've never been a friend of Typo3. Has much to do with the project leader of Typo3. He's a total radical Christian religious guy. So he invites people to kickoff meetings and etc., where they go skiing and then they have to pray 3 times a day or something else, and I don't like that stuff. So in Mambo it was a small company from Australia or New Zealand that was managing everything, and they had good relationships with the community. However, they had this typical thing, you had to assign the copyright of all your patches and changes to this company, which allowed them to relicense it under non-open source license. At a given point, if you want to have this and that feature, and the feature won't go in. And that's where they got so upset that they forked it, and they created Joomla. And Joomla, J-O-O-M-L-A, is now the more successful part. Mambo still exists, and now it's the other way around. Mambo is taking stuff from Joomla and putting it into their product. They still can because it's open source. But Joomla is now the core of programming and the core of community activities. So it's not that simple. You don't look at a project and then, oh, this is successful, there's a big company behind that, so it will work forever. It will not work forever. If a community gets unhappy, they move along, because they typically have no direct economic interest in maintaining whatever stuff they don't like. Open source is a lot about motivation and fun and being part of a movement and etc. And if that fun goes away, you go to something else. That's normal. And that's a health check for community. Find out how long does it exist, how many people join, leave, how many fights are going on the mailing list. All of this classification can and should be done. And I'll give you some concrete examples of where to check. So for example, if you're in government-related stuff, thank you. If you're into government-related solutions, then the European Commission in Europe has created a website called OSOR. OSOR is the open source observation repository, sponsored and paid by the European Commission, where governments and administrations can inform themselves about existing open source projects that are relevant to administration. This is a sort of boring area of open source, but a very interesting area to work in. And they have on OSOR EU, under projects, you can search for projects, you can find new projects, you can see who is behind it, how it is organized, how it is licensed, etc., etc., etc. Now, the two fundamental differences that I always like to point out here is, be noted, there is this weird concept called open core. Open core is, to put it in friendly words, open core means the basis of the software typically is open source, and there are some parts in there that are not open source. Yeah, so typical example of that is whatever replacement for Microsoft Exchange, no matter if it's Zimbra or OpenExchange or whatever you want, then typically the Outlook connector, a piece of software you have to install on the Windows to connect Outlook to this new Exchange replacement, this connector typically costs money. So you can get the whole server up and running, no problem, you can hook it up to Linux clients, it will work, everything is brilliant, but as soon as you want to have Microsoft in there, you have to pay for it. Now, these people are saying they need to do that to make money. And they look at Red Hat as saying, you are the perfect abnormal company because nobody else in the market makes money with open source. Now, I say then you're all getting it wrong and Red Hat gets it right. And as long as there's only one company that gets it right, it's fine with me as long as I work there. It's okay. But beware of open core because we've seen it a lot that first of all, you need to do copyright transfer if you commit stuff. So effectively, you're supporting a company without being paid. And secondly, they can always decide to make other parts not open source anymore. So I would typically only focus on projects that are real community driven, with either a foundation or just a group of users behind it. If it is corporate driven, make sure it guarantees the freedom that you're looking for and you don't move into the next lock-in situation. Now, with all that in mind, OSOR makes it quite simple to look through this. You can look up the website yourself, go through it and find stuff. We also have the wonderful, extremely old solution called Fresh Meat. It's from the time where stupid domain names were thought to be very interesting. It was created around the same time as SourceForge and the other things. And Fresh Meat also gives you a lot of information. You can also search by license on all sorts of open source projects. But again, remind yourself, not every open source project is listed in these projects. There is no general overarching directory of everything open source that exists out there. So ask around in these communities, look at their forums, look at their mailing lists, which is typically the heart of everything. So as Pieros explained yesterday, forums are typically looking nice but not really used by many projects. And I can assure you from a developer perspective, there is nothing I could care less about than forums. Because it turned out to be, the heart of flame wars, not connected. I cannot take them with me on my laptop. I cannot read them when I'm sitting on the toilet. And that's exactly not what I want, and that's why I focus on mailing lists. But some people believe in forums, and they're wholly convinced about that. So support-wise, forums are quite interesting to look at, because you can actually see how many questions are replied to, how many questions are answered. One of my personal favorite indicators of the health of an open source project is the FAQ. So is it maintained, or does it reflect whatever old version that has never been updated? Because I'm more into the BSD way of thinking than into the Linux way of thinking when it comes to that. My personal opinion is if a project does not have good documentation, they should go away. Documentation is very, very important in my opinion, because it saves a lot of questions, can make sure that you can start working right away. But many projects tend to ignore documentation. No good man pages, no FAQs, etc. If you come across that, ask around in the community. Hey, where's the FAQ? Typically it's hidden somewhere in the source repository under documentation. But sometimes it doesn't even exist, and people expect you to understand how it works. So that was a very, very short run-through on how to find, search, qualify for open source projects. It's a piece of art that you have to experience and learn. Don't expect to go there right now, but simply ask around. Rule number one in open source is communicate. So if you find mailing lists, if you find local tools, ask around, what are you using? For example, e-learning. Everybody now, if I say e-learning and open source, what's your reply? What's the best open source solution for e-learning? Moodle. Everybody talks about Moodle. So Moodle is another very interesting thing. What I specifically like about Moodle is the irony behind it. Lots of universities and organizations are using Moodle for e-learning and courses and etc., but keep the content of the courses completely hidden and proprietary. So there are big conferences where all these Moodle people and Moodle users meet and discuss how good they are doing it and how wonderful it is. I'm from Bavaria in Germany, in Munich, and the University of Munich is using Moodle big time for everything. And one of the administrators of Moodle, I talked to him and I said, well, this is really cool, and where can I download the course content, your training content? I just want to look at it. No, it's only for our students. We will never ever make that publicly available. And I think, yeah, you're fundamentally wrong. This is not open source. Think about sharing the content, sharing the knowledge. Why is every university reinventing the wheel, setting up the same fundamental algorithms part 1, algorithms part 2, mathematical foundations of computing science, blah, blah, blah. It's, the books exist since 20 years, the content is the same since 20 years. Start sharing. So they use open source, but they don't understand open source. That's the point that I'm getting at. By sharing the content?
Yeah, open content. Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't use Moodle though. It's got a sort of a custom e-learning thing called Moodle. You know Moodle, huh? Yeah, but it's based on
The line is based on Sakai, and Sakai is also an open source project.
Yeah.
Okay.
But within Moodle, there's a sort of an area called open content, UCT open content, where they're encouraging coursework to be put there.
Yeah. Yeah. So MIT, for example, is doing this also big time. They're publishing a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
And then again, if you have 2, 3, open content has a lot of stuff.
Open content.
Yeah.
That's the site.
Yeah. So, and then again, it's very good to hear that the university here is doing this stuff. However, if they use whatever obscure system to do it that nobody else uses, it doesn't really help. So, and that's point number 2, from open source to open standards. So, as a programming task, I would, for example, find it very interesting. Can we take the content that UCT puts up someplace and convert it into Moodle stuff that Moodle can understand, and then make it accessible to a lot of more people using Moodle? That would be an interesting project. So Moodle is a sort of de facto standard now. Yeah.
Everything is handled within our internet.
No, which is okay. I fully understand. There are lots of parts that you don't want to share and you shouldn't share. Perfectly fine. But however, even if you don't want to share, you should at least know that other people are willing to share and check their stuff. So there is this open source university in
A lot of money, I think, for the internet's web CT.
Mhm.
I don't know. It keeps the department going. That's why they.
Of course.
It keeps the one we've got a whole section. Keeps them going.
Yeah.
The salary, it keeps
Yeah.
them payroll.
Yeah.
But if they went open source, that whole department would be gone.
Yeah, well, but it will happen anytime. It will happen anyway.
I think another course
they spend like
content
100 grand.
is sort of a research paper. I see sort of a big business. I see this with IEEE. Like they've got all these research material that they want you to use in your papers for citing and whatever.
Yeah.
But before you can read that, they want you to pay or
Yeah.
or even subscribe.
Yeah.
So I sort of don't get the gist of it, because once you cite them, the more you cite them, the more points they get.
Yeah.
But for you to get to that document which you need to cite, you have to pay them.
Yeah.
So that's also
That's totally ridiculous. I've seen that in libraries where they have these lots of scientific magazines and etc. and then they have 3 computers where you're allowed to look at them, but you cannot open the same document on more than 1 computer at the same time.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're not even allowed to print them, which is even more ridiculous.
Yeah.
So you have paid for a subscription, but then you're not allowed to print the stuff.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, it'll change over time.
Yeah, because the open content, I'm not sure, it's still closed content in most of the places.
Exactly, and but it will creep in. It's already starting. So you know, this is one of the reasons that we at Red Hat, for example, sponsors a $100 laptop project. You know, the OLPC, exactly for that. Not because it's cool hardware and etc. It is also, but because the concept, this machine, the $100 laptop, cannot control copyright or digital restriction management. I never call it digital rights management because that's the wrong term. It's restriction management. You don't get more freedom with digital rights management. They take freedom away from you. So it's restriction management. And you know, if you look at it from that perspective, the $100 laptop has nothing in there that would allow you to do some sort of restriction management. So it's a machine built for sharing, and that's why Microsoft doesn't like it. You know? But it's going in that direction anyway, and everybody knows that students are copying textbooks and trying to save money everywhere and etc., which is plain normal. So allow them to do it in a free way. You know, it's no need for them to work over hours in whatever McDonald's night shifts to be able to pay for textbooks that are the same for 20 years. You know, give it to them for free.
The people who run WULA at UCT had a workshop for staff members. Well, it was open to students as well, so I went along, where they were introducing this open content thing and saying how many universities actually have benefited by making their content open.
Yeah.
And the one example was a university in West Africa where they had research on tropical diseases like malaria, which could not be done elsewhere in the world because, you know, those diseases only occur in tropics. And it eventually resulted in it was recognized that these are the leading researchers in the world of these tropical diseases, and their work eventually became sort of standard coursework even in American universities because they had made it open.
Yeah.
And so then they started getting funding that used to be channeled through American universities for research to be done in Africa is now funneled directly to them. So they benefited greatly just by opening their content.
Yeah. Yeah, this sharing makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But in sharing, make sure that you're credited for it. You know, don't put it at some anonymous place and say, "Boh, here's the stuff, we don't care anymore." But make it an active project. So maintaining open content for Courseware and etc. to me is exactly the same as managing an open source project. I don't care if the content is software code or scientific articles. It's technically the same stuff. You need a server, you need a community, you need mailing lists, you need some sort of version control system. You know, if something is updated in a scientific article because there was a mistake, you need to find out there is an update. It's effectively the same as open source software management. And that's why the principles that we're talking about here this week, you know, can really apply to a lot of different fields. And that's also what we're hoping for, that you don't only look at open source software, but really take it into other levels and see how you can benefit from them there. And these are wonderful success stories. So, you know, if suddenly these multinational American corporations and universities do not get the money and they give some breadcrumbs to whatever African institute, but the money goes directly there and they get recognized for it, and their status in the scientific world is rising. This is what we want. This is what we care about.
Sorry, I don't know if you mentioned. Can I ask, how does Red Hat take money? Just a couple of seconds.
Okay.
You said that the only company that makes money out of open source. How?
Yeah, that's what many people are
If they're
telling.
If they're not like doing what other people are doing, give you the first bit and then you pay for the patch or how is Red Hat making money?
Shall I answer that? I think we spoke about it.
You can try.
Okay. Yeah, I think Red Hat. Okay. But in few words, they make money from the support services. You know, they give you when you buy an enterprise edition of Red Hat, and
You get it for free.
no, you only get Fedora for free.
Yeah. So.
Red Hat used to be free. Is it free?
Yeah. I know. Let's save that for Thursday for the social event. So no, effectively, what the way we are making money is by allowing people to kick our ass. Yeah, we give the support and service. We are a sort of insurance company that maintains the stability of the enterprise distribution. That's our job, and for that service we ask money. And then also the support part, you can call us, we solve your problem with defined SLAs and etc. It's all service on top of free software. So the software itself is always 100% pure, completely free and available. Now you can go to our web server, to our FTP server, etc. You can download all sources, all patches and etc. because that's not the value of Red Hat. The value is that we have our build system, we digitally sign the packages, the RPMs that we deliver to our customers with our GPG key, so you can be sure that nobody is altering them, there are no viruses, Trojans or whatever. That also doesn't exist on Linux, but anyway, customers keep asking for that. And your right to have access to these verified packages and etc., that's part of the subscription. So that's what you pay us for. And if you pay us money, you're completely free to choose whatever version you want. We have no upgrade or downgrade or whatever fees. Every 2 years, there's a new major version. So in the next few weeks, months, RHEL 6, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6 will come, which means we will support at the same time RHEL 3, RHEL 4, RHEL 5, and RHEL 6. Oh no, RHEL 3 is falling out now. So 4, 5, and 6. And you decide which version you want to use. You can switch every day if you want to. We don't care. You get the full right to everything we support. That's a simple deal. And with that, we make it consumable for companies, because companies need certified environments. So we invest most of our money in certification, certifying Oracle databases, certifying on IBM, Dell, HP hardware, so that you get a full certified solution that you can use, and there's always someone that you can kick in the ass if something goes wrong. That's effectively the business model. Now, Open Core typically has a different, so it's the same with Canonical, by the way. So Canonical is giving away everything for free, and now they offer support agreements on top of that. But if I am a user of Canonical, you will have a hard time to convince me that I have to pay for the same stuff that I can also get for free. You know, and we had the same stuff with Red Hat Linux at that time until we switched to the enterprise Linux model with subscriptions. So yes, you can say that we're not making it available for free anymore, which is technically correct. But on the other hand, all the sources are there. People are rebuilding from our sources. There's stuff like CentOS, Oracle Enterprise Linux, Scientific Linux, Whitebox Linux, etc., 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 that are all built on the same sources that we use, but it's not Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And for this right, for this specific right to get this updated, stable, guaranteed version, that's where you pay money for. But again, yeah.
Please, I want to ask, for you to get access to this code, the open source code, you need to join the members, the community members.
To get the code, no. You can just get it. You can always get it. You don't have to join anything at all.
It's only when you want to participate in the
Yeah.
development that you need to join.
Then you typically should join, because nobody will accept any changes from someone they've never seen before. So that's why you typically participate in mailing lists, in discussions, and etc. So that people say, okay, I know this woman, this man, etc. And then you're free to also submit patches.
If you want to modify it, those people involved, they can they be of help to you?
Mm-hmm. So okay, it's now far too long again.
Okay, let's move on.
Let's move on.
Okay. So
Shall we have a 5